Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a look at the 2020 election map between Joe Biden and Donald Trump solely based on 538's polling averages. Now one little thing before we get started that I should point out is that 538 does not have a polling average available for every single state. For example, in Minnesota, it's not necessarily a safe state in polling numbers, but since we don't have a weighted polling average available, I have labeled it as a safe state in the Democratic column because the Democrats won there in 2016. That is also the case in Maine, New Mexico, and in the state of Montana. The state of Colorado, though, on the other hand, we do in fact have a polling average available, but Joe Biden is plus 17, which is more than enough for a safe classification. Now, as for how the classifications work, this far out from election day, anything from 0 to 2 points I label as tilt. From 2 to 7 points is lean, and anything from 7 to 12 points is likely, while anything above 12 points I consider a safe state for either party. Starting out by looking at this map in front of you, all of these states that are still in gray are where we have a 538 polling average available, and the margin is not enough for a safe classification for either party. Starting out in the state of Nevada. In Nevada, Joe Biden is plus 8.7 as things stand right now on July 7th, 2020, which is more than enough for a likely classification in the state of Nevada for Joe Biden. Now, this is not really much of a surprise given that Hillary Clinton won in Nevada in 2016 by a decent margin, and Joe Biden is expected to do so again in 2016. However, the first big surprise coming in this video is in the state of Utah, where Donald Trump is only plus 7.8 right now in polling average data, whereas all the way back looking at February 27th, 2020, he was plus 19.3, but now July 7th just plus 7.9, which is a lower margin of lead in Utah for Donald Trump than Joe Biden has in the state of Nevada, which is really remarkable. It's only enough for a likely column in the state of Utah. Now, keep in mind, Utah was a state that in 2016 a lot of more left-leaning sites and news organizations considered a toss-up state heading into election day because of the added factor of McMullen, the independent candidate, who won about 20% of the vote, but Donald Trump had no issues defeating Hillary Clinton in the state of Utah on election day. It was not at all a toss-up, really much more of a safe, deep red state for Donald Trump. And I expect that to happen again this November, but it is interesting to see that right now, Donald Trump only has about a 7-point advantage over Joe Biden in Utah. Now, as for the state of Arizona, Arizona is a state that is moving more and more left as the elections go on, and Joe Biden has a plus 3.1 advantage right now. Now, he has maintained about a 2 to 4 point advantage basically all over the past few months, and it is enough for a lean classification in favor of Joe Biden in the state of Arizona. No real surprise. We do expect Arizona to be more of a tilt in favor of Joe Biden this November, and as things stand right now in the polling data, it continues to trend that way. Now, another surprise here, though, similarly to Utah, the state of Kansas, really thought of as normally a very deep red and safe Republican state, especially for Donald Trump. He's only plus 8.9 right now in polling averages, which again is only enough for a likely classification in favor of Donald Trump. Now, Kansas, I don't expect to be a very competitive presidential race. The Senate race in Kansas, on the other hand, is very close and could be possibly considered even an effective toss-up between Chris Kobach there and Barbara Boilet. Now, it's not likely to impact the presidential election that much. Maybe we'll see a few more points in favor of Joe Biden than initially expected in a state like Kansas, but I do believe that Donald Trump will still win the state of Kansas by safe margins by plus 15 points. Now, as for the state of Texas, now Texas is a very interesting state race to watch this cycle because if Joe Biden is able to flip the state of Texas, he will 100% win this election. There is not a doubt that if Joe Biden wins the state of Texas, he will win the election and the Republican Party will be in deep, deep trouble for the foreseeable future. But right now, Donald Trump maintains a 1.3 point advantage, which is enough to keep it as a tilt in favor of Donald Trump. I actually do see this polling average pretty accurate in terms of what will likely to happen in November. I think it's going to be very close, maybe more 2 to 3 points in the overall margin of victory, but 1.3 points is not completely out of the realm of possibility. Now, as for the state of Missouri, maybe another surprise. Missouri is not necessarily thought of as a competitive state in election cycles, but look at this. Donald Trump is only 2.5 points ahead of Joe Biden right now in polling averages, which is only barely enough for a lean classification in the state of Missouri. He's leading in the state of Missouri by less than Joe Biden is leading in a state like Arizona, which is really, really interesting. Now, keep in mind, Barack Obama came extremely close to winning in the state of Missouri in 2008 before Mitt Romney eventually won by about 15 points in 2012, and then Donald Trump even extended upon that margin of victory in 2016. So all signs were pointing towards Missouri becoming more of a deeper red state, but in these polling averages, it is not showing to be that way. Now, Tennessee is another one that is really surprising to see not as a very deep red state in favor of Donald Trump. Maybe out of all four of these states, rather, Utah, Kansas, Missouri, and Tennessee, out of these four surprising states to see more competitive, Tennessee is thought of as maybe the most deep red state, and it's only plus 10.7 in favor of Donald Trump. Again, only enough for a likely classification. Now, I do expect Donald Trump to win in Tennessee by maybe 20 or so points. I don't think it's going to be very close, but interesting nonetheless. Now, as for the states of Georgia and Florida, these are two states that are actually going to be very competitive this election cycle. Joe Biden is plus 1.7 points in Georgia, which is enough for a tilt in favor of his column, while in the state of Florida, Joe Biden is plus 6.3, enough for just a lean classification in the state of Florida. Now, Georgia and Florida are ones to watch. Florida is always consistently one of the closest races in basically every election cycle, typically decided by 0 to 2 points, a tilt margin. I expect it to be somewhere in that margin, and we could still see Donald Trump carry the state of Florida. It is completely not unrealistic to assume that Donald Trump can carry the state of Florida and the state of Georgia. Georgia is much less likely to flip in favor of the Democrats than a state like Florida is, but it's interesting to see the polling data in Georgia nonetheless, with it now being considered a toss-up state by the Cook political rating. The state of Georgia has a lot of very interesting races, not just in the presidential race, but a lot of very interesting congressional races and Senate races going on there. Now, as for the states of South Carolina and North Carolina, the two Carolinas. Now, South Carolina is typically considered a much more red state and less competitive than North Carolina, but look at this. Donald Trump only plus 7.2, which is just barely enough to make it a likely in favor of his column and not a lean instead. Now, as for the state of North Carolina, on the other hand, Joe Biden has a plus 3.2 advantage, which is enough for a lean classification in the state of North Carolina. Now, North Carolina went to Donald Trump in 2016, and it went to Mitt Romney in 2012. Barack Obama was the last Democrat to win in the state of North Carolina in 2008. However, in 2012 and in 2016, it was still very close and a very competitive state, with all trends pointing towards a much more likely scenario in which Joe Biden is actually able to win in the state than Donald Trump. Now, South Carolina is I don't expect to be that competitive, maybe more in the 10 to 15 point range. It's a little bit more competitive than the states such as Tennessee, Kansas, Missouri, and Utah, but not very competitive nonetheless. Moving on to the state of Virginia now, we have plus 11.2 in favor of Joe Biden, enough for a likely classification for him. No real surprise in the state of Virginia. Republicans haven't won a statewide election there in over 10 years. It is moving further and further left as the years go on. Now, as for the states of Iowa and Ohio, very similar states in political spectrum. Right now in the state of Iowa, complete toss-up. 0.0 points, 45.7 for Donald Trump, 45.7 for Joe Biden in these polls, where we see Joe Biden may be up a little bit, but in the polling average weighting for how the 538 does it with weighing, accounting for each poll's quality, sample size, and recency, it is an effective toss-up. So we're going to leave it as completely gray here in this video. Now, moving on to the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio and Iowa rather, are states that are very similar usually in presidential election years. 2008 and 2012 both went to Barack Obama. However, in 2016, they flipped by extensive margins in favor of Donald Trump. Now, as for the polling average in the state of Ohio, Joe Biden is plus 2.6, enough for a lean in favor of his column. Now, I personally still believe that Donald Trump is more of a tilt, or Ohio rather, is more in the tilt margin for Donald Trump. I still think he will win in the state of Ohio, and I still think he will win in the state of Iowa. However, by much lower margins than he did in 2016. But moving on to the upper Midwest and the upper Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, arguably the three most important states in this election cycle. The most important area in this election cycle is this Rust Belt: Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. These are the 5 states that, in geographically speaking, will decide this election cycle. Now, in the state of Wisconsin, we have Joe Biden plus 8.1, enough for a likely here in his column. And in the state of Michigan, we also have a likely margin with Joe Biden up 9.7 points, so maybe a little bit higher than in the state of Wisconsin. Michigan is maybe thought of as a little bit more of a Democratic state typically than Wisconsin is, and thus it has a little bit more of an advantage for Joe Biden. If I had to pick between these two states, which is more likely to go to Joe Biden, it would be the state of Michigan. I fully expect the state of Michigan to go in favor of Joe Biden. Another state I do expect to go to Joe Biden as things stand right now, the state of Pennsylvania, plus 7.5 points right now for Joe Biden, which is also enough for a likely. So as you can see right now, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, if Joe Biden flips the three states from 2016 in his column, he wins the presidency. Just like that. He won't need to win in states like Arizona. He won't need to win in North Carolina. He won't need to win in Georgia. He won't even need to win in Florida. He won't even need to win in Iowa or Ohio. If he wins these three states, he wins the presidency by reaching the 270 mark. And finally, our final state to go over, the state of New Hampshire. This was Hillary Clinton's lowest margin of victory in the 2016 election cycle, and Joe Biden is plus 8.3 there. Similarly to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, this is a likely in favor of his column. So as you can see, as things stand right now, Joe Biden has 367 votes in his column to Donald Trump's 165, simply based off of polling averages, with the state of Iowa as a complete toss-up where the polling average is 0.0, not in favor of either candidate. So this is, by modern election standards, a complete and utter electoral landslide in favor of Joe Biden if this were the case. Now, I personally don't see this happening. If you've been looking at my predictions and projections previously, you'll see that I am a lot more generous in favor of Donald Trump than the polling data and all of these statistics necessarily show, because Donald Trump's ability to typically overperform polls, plus the fact that this is basically as bad as it is going to get for Donald Trump. I do expect things to tighten maybe a little bit more by election day. I still think that Joe Biden could very likely win the popular vote by, say, 6 to 8 points nationally, in which case we will in all likelihood see a Joe Biden presidency after November. However, as things stand right now, this is the polling average: 367 electoral votes in favor of Joe Biden, 165 for Donald Trump. This would be a monumental victory. If Joe Biden wins by, say, over 10 points nationally, we could certainly see these kind of margins in some of these states. Maybe we see South Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, Kansas, and Utah be competitive somewhat, but I personally don't see it as such. I still do believe that these will all be safe states at the end of the day for the Republican Party, while the states like Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida will be very hard for Joe Biden to flip personally. But I do think he has a very good shot of flipping the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the state of Arizona. But that does it for today's video. Please make sure to like and subscribe, as well as check out all of the other content on the channel. I have a ton of content regarding the 2020 election, both the presidential election, the Senate elections, the House elections, the governor elections even, all of that on this channel. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and tune in next time.